Hello, listeners. It's Gunter Swoboda here with some exciting news. We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self-development and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome back everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with me, that's Gunter. I'm your host, and as I'm going to make the assumption that everybody out there in the world knows that Australia's just had an extraordinary election, and that's been analysed and is continuing to be analysed in all sorts of different ways. But there was one outstanding feature that's been sort of coming along, not just because of the election, but over a long period of time. And it was actually crystallised when a friend of mine asked me that a really seriously important question that I don't think most people really tend to ask in various situations. And that is, why would an Indigenous leader with full knowledge of the documented brutality of colonisation stand in public and deny that colonisation had an ongoing negative effect or effects? Why would someone with deep cultural lineage and ancestral memory speak in ways that seemingly align with those who have historically oppressed, displaced and marginalised her people, and in fact are continuing to do so in many different ways, passively or actively? This is not just a political question, people. In fact, when we drill down into it, it's a deeply psychological one. And it brings us face to face with a concept that is as subtle as it is powerful, and that's internalized oppression. Now, I've done a podcast previously that spoke about that concept essentially about men, and I'll come back in the end to that too. So let me help you to explore what it is, how it operates, and how it shows up in the public sphere, especially through figures like Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. In September 2023, Senator Price, who's an Indigenous Walpiri Celtic woman, stood at the National Press Club and made the following statement: "I don't believe there are ongoing negative impacts of colonisation on Indigenous Australians. Positive impact? Absolutely. Now we got running water and we got readily available food. When she was asked about intergenerational trauma, she doubled down. If it's the case that Indigenous Australians are suffering from intergenerational trauma, then so are those of us whose ancestors were dispossessed of their own lands in the UK. We don't see people behaving violently because of that trauma, do we?
This has been Devonna Prinzi, an executive producer with Inspire Change with Gunter. This week on Inspire Change with Gunter, we're sending out our gratitude to our listeners in Ohio, and particularly the cities of Cincinnati, Springfield, and Dayton. Your loyal listening has brought your state to the top 3 of listeners in the USA. We appreciate your patronage. And an update for our listeners that we spoke about last week in Ferdinanda Beach, Florida. Your regular listeners brought Florida to the top 3 in the USA and added more listeners from Orlando, Tampa, and Bellevue. Thank you, and don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe. And let's all keep inspiring change around the world.
And then came the voice to Parliament, the referendum debate, where the country narrowly voted against giving Indigenous Australians the voice. And she suggested that if you expect the government to solve your problems, then maybe the problem is you. Now, in many respects, that's a classic neoliberal statement. I'm not sure if she's aware of that, but, I'm not here to vilify her in any way. I'm just trying to give an example of what the motivation behind some of her statements may be. And in fact, help understand her more. So I'm coming from a place that suggests compassion rather than hostility. Now, these statements weren't just controversial. They were deeply disorienting for many Indigenous Australians and their allies. For those who work in mental health, social justice, and trauma-informed care, they are also diagnostically revealing. So how do we understand this? How do we hold the tension between her identity and her politics, between ancestry and advocacy? So here's the question. What is internalized oppression? Now, internalized oppression is a psychological and sociocultural process where individuals from marginalised groups unconsciously absorb the dominant society's negative views, values, and stereotypes about their own group. In psychodynamic terms, it's a form of introjection, a defence mechanism where the psyche unconsciously internalises external values and attitudes to reduce anxiety or gain a sense of belonging. Rather than saying they think I'm inferior, the internal voice becomes I am inferior or my people are the problem. Now, this mechanism mostly begins in early life, usually reinforced through schooling, media, social messaging, and institutional bias. The individual seeking safety or success, security, aligns with the dominant group, not necessarily out of betrayal, but as a driver to survive. Unfortunately, within that construct, the person never really gets to emotionally and socially thrive because there's a cost. When internalized, these beliefs become self-directed aggression. They manifest as shame, disconnection from community, perfectionism, emotional suppression, or, as in public figures, repeating dominant narratives under the banner of individual accountability or hard truths. Now, when you're part of a political party, you are in that space actually made to feel safe because they echo or are the source of what it is that is oppressive. So you get validation for being part of the group, which sort of, in a sense, may offset that process. And most of this, ultimately, as I said, is unconscious. In Senator Price's case, her language mirrors many of the core tenets of colonial ideology. The idea that modernity, infrastructure, and Western governance have rescued Indigenous people from backwardness, that trauma is a personal failing, not a social injury, not a moral injury, and that systemic inequality is a myth. I can harken back to the days of Margaret Thatcher and many, many right-wing political movements, including the MAGA movement in the United States, and how they perceive non-white, non-English speaking people. From a psychodynamic point of view, we could view this as a case of internalized projection, where disavowed or painful parts of the self, feelings of cultural grief, rage, or vulnerability, are projected outward, either onto other Indigenous people or pathologized as a dysfunction rather than recognized as trauma. Now, to be clear, this is not about psychologizing away legitimate political differences. Jacinta Price has every right to hold and express her views. I may not agree with them. I may see them as regressive rather than progressive. But then when those views actually and actively deny well-established evidence of intergenerational trauma, systemic marginalisation, and the psychological signals of a deeper fracture, a split between identity and allegiance, between heritage and narratives, we've got issues. So the next question we might want to ask is, how does internalised depression show up in practice? You don't have to be a politician to experience internalised depression. In therapy, I see it show up in a young man of colour who avoids dating women from his own cultural background because he believes they're too dramatic. A gay client who constantly jokes about not being a real man when he cries or struggles with intimacy. A female executive who subtly sabotages other women in her workplace, believing there's only room for one at the top. It's important to recognise that these are not character flaws. These are injuries of internalisation. The repeated drip feed of cultural messages. You're less than, you're weak, you're a problem. And these eventually become an inner script embedded in your unconscious and subconscious. Now, as always, healing a script like that requires awareness. It requires language and often a return to belonging. So again, as with, for example, the father wound or, the internalized depression of patriarchy, how do we heal this internalized wound? In therapy, addressing internalized depression involves several steps. Firstly, it's about naming the process. Realizing this isn't just how I am, but how I've been shaped is crucial. The second step, the second part of the process is decoupling shame from identity. Learning that internalized beliefs are not truths, but coping strategies. The third step in the process is reconnecting with community. And this, for someone like Senator Price, might be really, really difficult because she's invested her whole career into this position that she's adopted. Whereas what would be appropriate would be perhaps reclaiming pride, language, culture and history, an immersion into your Indigenous culture. And the fourth phase is you've got to challenge dominant narratives, especially the ones that are disguised as common sense or tough love. And most importantly, and this is, I can't stress this enough, healing involves grieving what was lost, denied, or turned against in the effort to survive in a society that devalues difference. So, as I move towards the end of the podcast, the question now comes up, what can we learn? Well, Jacinta Price's public statements, whether we agree with them or not, can teach us something vital. That identity is not fixed. It's shaped, bent, and sometimes broken under the weight of social pressure. Just like gender. When we see someone who looks like the community but speaks like the colonizer, it is easy to condemn. But the more transformative path is to understand, not to excuse, but to illuminate. To ask what pain lives beneath the performance, what belonging was denied, what anger got folded inward. The point is not to vilify Senator Price or anyone else caught in these dynamics. It's to ask yourself, where do I replicate the voice of the oppressor in my own mind? And how might I reclaim it, not with judgment, but with compassion and courage? And this is why I say persistently that inspired change begins within. Internalized oppression doesn't end in a headline. It lives in the quiet decisions we make every day. How we speak to ourselves, how we show up in relationships, how we treat others from our own community. This concept also applies to masculinity, where individuals have internalized the oppression of patriarchy. And that includes women as well. This is not just about men. This internalized oppression hinders the ability to heal and to assert one's self-worth, to come into one's own real, true value as a human being. This complicates the collective journey towards reclaiming voices that say, I'm worthy, I belong. My community thrives through mutual support and understanding. And that is the real work of inspired change. And I hope today's episode has invited you to reflect, not just on public figures, but on the personal journey towards liberation from internalized narratives. So, until next time, this is me, Gunter. Keep on questioning, keep feeling, and above all, keep inspiring change. And this is me, signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.